Hello, Brobs. I'm back with Napoleon, Bisexual Emperor. The actual color of this cover is a little bit different than is shown. I'm pretty red-green colorblind, so I can't really tell what color it actually is. I believe it's either purple or dark blue. But I just got back from the same sale where I purchased that book and just got a whole crate of other Napoleon books. Whereas I had relatively none before, now I have, 12, 13 Napoleon books. Not that I'll ever read them, but here we go. Napoleon, Bisexual Emperor by Major General Frank Richardson, MD. We left off right here. It was the French who were given the first taste of the latent cruelty of their future emperor after the first success of his military career at the siege of Toulon. Is that the same guy that was in that Puppet Master movie? Toulon. Captain Bonaparte, still very much a Corsican, mowed down large number of royalists and liberated convicts herded into the great square of Toulon. The young artillery commander then announced loudly that the vengeance of the French Republic was satisfied and they should now rise and go to their homes. They did so, and received another withering blast of artillery. 2 years later, when the convention needed a ruthless soldier to suppress the royalist rising of Vendemiaire, they knew to whom they could look for a whiff of grape shot in the streets of Paris itself. Some 3.5 years after this second helping of hors d'oeuvres for purely French consumption, the world had its first chance of sampling the sort of fare it could expect from this man whose name was beginning to sound so ominously in its ears. The Syrian campaign of 1799 marred Bonaparte's growing military reputation with its first indelible stain, proving that the young general was as ruthless, cold-hearted, and careless of human life as the middle-aged dictator was to be. The name of Jaffa remained in his memory to the end of his days as the scene of two incidents to which he occasionally referred in specious attempts to justify his actions. Of course, it was embarrassing for him to have thousands of Turkish prisoners on his hands during his bold invasion of Syria, of which Palestine was then a part, but no arguments based on military expediency can absolve him of the shame of having had some 5,000 prisoners of war butchered in batches on the beach. Before the bloody business was done, he had ordered that, to save ammunition, the bayonet was to be used. I mean, that's practical. Honestly, I mean, you're killing people. Does it really matter if you lay them down and say, listen, brother, I got to give you a little cyanide tab, or you stab them to death? What's the difference? It's just like humane treatment of animals before you murder them to feed them, put them in a McHappy Meal. McHappy Meal? Oh, McHappy Meal. Yeah. I mean, you're killing them. What's it matter how you do it? That's why I'm always shocked when people are like, he murdered her, decapitated her, and then had sex with her skull. I mean, he literally chopped her head off. I mean, what do you think this guy is going to do? He had great difficulty in finding an officer to carry out these executions. Humane French observers of the ghastly scene were appalled and apprehensive of the condemnation and possible retribution which they feared would be the punishment of a nation guilty of such inhumanity. The massacre of prisoners could never be anything but wrong. I roll my R's horribly, but historians have not found it so easy to determine the rights and wrongs of the poisoning at Jaffa of his own French soldiers, who were gravely ill with plague. Bonapartists have justified it as mercy-killing. When trying to persuade Dr. Degenerate to cooperate in carrying out the sad task, Napoleon said if he were dying of plague, a merciful overdose of opium would be his dearest wish. Doctors may feel proud of Degenerate, that's what I'm going to go with, Degenerate, for saying at risk of his career that his mission was to save life, not to destroy it. He knew that some of his patients might survive, as some of them did even after being given the lethal drug, which led to the belief that some of the pharmacists who administered it deliberately reduced the dose. At the time, Napoleon tried to make light of the incident, saying that after all, the opium had saved some 40 men from their sufferings and the army from their plaints. But later he preferred to claim that he had intended only to leave the opium available for use by the sufferers if capture by Arabs or Turks was imminent. Even if this was his true motive, the real charge against him is that he was ready to sacrifice these patients and many of his wounded soldiers to save his own military reputation. In the eyes of the world, he could have obtained from Admiral Sir Sidney Smith a safe conduct, and even help in the evacuation of his casualties by sea, but rather than admit the straits to which he was reduced and risk censure by the Directory, he preferred to abandon wounded men along the line of his retreat and poison the sick. That he considered his own reputation before the welfare of his troops did not go unnoticed in the army of Egypt, but he was soon to forsake them all and return to France. By the time the survivors reached their homeland, Napoleon had led fresh troops to victory after victory, and the Napoleonic legend was growing ever stronger. Napoleon's claim to have abolished flogging in the French army cannot really be set against the imputation of cruelty without some qualification, because it was mainly due to his enlightened views on the importance of the soldier's morale and the part which self-respect could play in this. Had it been humanity which prompted Napoleon, he would surely also have forbidden the cruel floggings of subject populations. Dr. Bourrienne wrote about the floggings which were ordered for the citizens of Hamburg, whom Napoleon was determined to ruin because of their friendship for England. All who did not leave the town for exile within the prescribed time received 50 blows with the cane, and Bourrienne adds with comical naivety that French gallantry substituted, with respect to females, the birch for the cane. In any case, it was not really Napoleon who abolished floggings in the army. The truth, and a very unpalatable truth, it is for us, is that flogging naturally disappeared in the French army, in which it was as impossible to continue it as it seemed to be to do away with it in our own army. Curiously enough, Napoleon allowed in his army various degrading and even cruel forms of punishment against which Wellington set his face. When his own safety or reputation were at stake, he could be far more ruthless than any general in our army. While still General Bonaparte, he pushed a certain Captain Fournois with his cane, making a rude remark about his gait. Fournois struck Bonaparte's cane with his sword and seemed about to attack him. However, he stabbed himself. Bonaparte then disarmed his whole company, which had set up a general murmur and ordered that every 10th man was to be shot next day. But Bonaparte pardoned them upon condition of serving for life in the colonies. Napoleon's cold, unfeeling nature grew from the contempt for all his fellow creatures, which he expressed many times. We may well forgive the fallen emperor, as he heard stones cast by Frenchmen rattling on the coach taking him on his way to Elba, for the bitter comment that he had been right to despise mankind. But even when not under stress, he had often averred that he had never really loved anybody, and a crowning, damning confession made to General Gourgaud, who was with him in St. Helena, was, "I only care for people who are useful to me, and so long as they are useful." Claude Manceron does not conceal the coarse language habitually used by Napoleon. He tells us that Napoleon used to say, "When I need someone, I am not too fastidious. I would kiss his arse, if necessary." In textbooks of abnormal psychology, claims to hate everybody, to love nobody, tend to recur in the case histories of victims of sexual perversions. Nowadays, no one is likely to doubt that cruelty in its many forms sends its roots deep down into our sexual instincts. All right, Freud. Napoleon's sadism must be discussed further when exploring his sexual inclinations. To attempt a detailed assessment of Napoleon as a general is outside the scope of this book, except in so far as his personality is concerned. His reputation rests securely on the brilliance and massive sweep of his early campaigns. His many victories, his inspired defense of France in 1814. He had an unsurpassed eye for country. What the hell does that mean? He had an unsurpassed eye for country, the ability to make quick decisions, and gifts of leadership which ensured that his plans would be loyally carried out by subordinates whom he knew how to choose and to bend to his will. He could read the minds of enemy generals and divine what was going on the other side of the Ill. His greatest weakness stemmed from the defects in his character, his basic inhumanity and cold, unloving nature. Posterity would learn how little he really cared for his soldiers, whose adoration he cultivated. No general who cared for his men should have earned this verdict from the celebrated historian of the British Army. I mean, there's a paragon of virtue and truth and honesty, a general of the British Army, Sir John Fortescue. In spite of many effusive orders and utterances, Napoleon took no care of his soldiers. He did not pay them, he did not feed them, he did not clothe them. He made no sufficient provision for the sick and wounded, and his hospitals were a disgrace to his name. The inevitable result was that his losses were gigantic. It is too often forgotten by the panegyrists of Napoleon that he was the most wasteful of commanders, and that a long war was consequently to him a fatal war. Here is the great general's Achilles' heel: logistics, the science of moving, quartering and supplying troops, and providing for their medical care. In the moving part of it he excelled, but for the rest he made no bones about it. The army must live and support itself, and France and the rapacious Bonaparte clan by plunder. A good revolutionary principle, perhaps, and one approved by Carnot, but hardly worthy of the army of the all-conquering emperor. If the conquered countries paid a heavy price, so in the end did the French army. The fewer the supply wagons, the faster the armies could move, but this bonus was lost when supplies were hard to find, and foraging parties, ranging far afield, delayed the start of a day's march. Worse still was the hostility aroused in the local population by the foraging, plundering soldiery. It was not General Winter who defeated Napoleon in 1812, as he always claimed. Before the Grand Army had even crossed the Russian frontier, it had begun to dwindle from sickness, bad management, and desertions, as Napoleon's unwilling allies stealthily abandoned his ill-nourished eagles. It is now known that the winter of 1812 was not exceptionally severe, but no normal precautions such as warm clothing had been taken against its onset. The ill discipline resulting from this neglect made a disproportionately large contribution to the devastating losses. Military critics have pointed to many mistakes which could have damaged his reputation, but for the cast-iron system which ensured that his successes were magnified and his failures attributed to others. His mistrust of others led to his disastrous mistake of trying to run the Spanish campaign from Central Europe. His capacity for self-deception and ability to confuse assumptions with facts were weaknesses for which he would have paid a stiffer price but for exceptional luck. No wonder his first question about a general was, is he lucky? Many of the generals against whom he fought when his own genius was blazing most brightly were of poor quality, elderly gentlemen, still wedded to the stately pavane of position warfare, of which the great object was to avoid casualties. They were mentally unprepared for the onslaught of the fierce Corsican, knife in hand. Wellington hit the nail on the head when he said, I suspect all the continental armies are half beaten before the battle begins. I at least will not be frightened beforehand. He never underestimated Napoleon and said that his presence on the field made a difference of 40,000 men. But he knew that Boney was not an officer and a gentleman, and said Bonaparte's mind is in all its details low and ungentlemanlike. I have never believed in him. I always called him Jonathan Wild the Great. The Great? All right. Adding in a sentence worthy of Sir Winston Churchill, scarcely ever as he tripped into truth. What did Napoleon care for the opinion of aristocrats like the Duke? More, I believe, than he admitted, although even in 1813, he could refer to himself as an upstart general who could not risk defeat, whereas hereditary monarchs could always keep their thrones despite disasters. The role of an upstart cocking schnooks at the crowned head suited the leader of men inherited from the fine revolutionary army, even whilst intent upon creating his bogus instant aristocracy and winning the support of the old nobility. He could play the little corporal, wandering round the campfires, gossiping with his old grognards, playing to the gallery with such well-publicized incidents as the story, possibly apocryphal, of how, instead of having a sleeping sentry shot, he took up the fallen musket and completed the tired man's tour of duty. His sword was his patent of nobility, and he could shrug off Wellington's little joke, in public at any rate. His private feelings are probed in Chapter 3. Napoleon's own verdict on his military genius was this: "If I appear always prepared, it is because before entering on an undertaking I have meditated for long and have foreseen what may occur. It is not genius which reveals to me suddenly and secretly what I have to do in circumstances unexpected by other people. It is reflection, it is meditation." His meditation was based on a very wide range of reading, and he filled many notebooks with comments on what he read. These notebooks have been analyzed in attempts to penetrate the secrets of his mind. His comments are of a surprisingly superficial nature and reveal an abnormal preoccupation with cruelty, massacres, and so on. It is war. When Napoleon urged his officers to read and read again the stories of the great captains, he presumably hoped that they would learn what made them leaders of men. There is no evidence that he sought such guidance for himself. His own leadership was an expression of his self-confidence and conviction of his own superiority over mankind. Mankind has reacted to this, and hostile hands have sought to drag him from his pedestal. It has even been suggested that he lacked the essential quality in a soldier, courage. This must be unjust. In his day, it was not possible for a man to become a military leader without being brave, and being seen to be brave. In the close fighting involved in many engagements, the soldiers had ample opportunities for judging this. Napoleon was often under fire, and there is no reason to suppose that his coolness was any less mock than Wellington's, which was proverbial. Napoleon often spoke of his personal attributes, but like any good soldier, he never boasted about his physical courage. He did, however, claim to have 2 o'clock in the morning courage, moral courage, which helped him to deal with unexpected situations and to appear calm and confident, even if racked by tormenting doubts. It has been unkindly suggested that he broke off his personal pursuit of Sir John Moore, whom he did the honor of regarding as the only foeman worthy of his steel, because he was afraid of assassination by Spanish guerrillas. This is hard to accept in view of his fiery leadership in pushing forward over the Guadarrama at Somosierra, overriding the leading general who thought it impossible to cross the pass. It is more likely that he realized that Moore, outnumbered as he was, no longer needed his personal attention. The last word about Napoleon's courage has not been said until we have considered his lifelong fear of hostile mobs, of which the 2 best-known examples occurred near the beginning and near the end of his career, early in his rise to power, when he briefly trod the tightrope between the throne and the scaffold during the coup de Brumaire. In 1799, he cowered and fell beneath the jostling and blows of outraged deputies and completely lost his nerve. In 1814, after his first abdication, during his journey to Elba, accompanied by the Allied commissioners, he plumbed the depths of degradation. Slighted by senior officers, notably by General Augereau, who insulted him and refused to take off his hat, Napoleon was surrounded by hostile mobs of war-weary Frenchmen, and more terrible, hysterical French women mourning lost sons, yelling abuse and throwing stones. The worst scenes were at Orgon, where he saw himself hanged in effigy. Cowering back in his coach, shouting "Vive le Roi!" at the command of a peasant named Durel, he was soon shaking and sobbing. A few miles further on, he left his carriage and disguised himself as a postilion after changing horses at Calade, whatever the fuck it is. He dressed himself in a grotesque mixture of Prussian, Russian, and Austrian uniforms. And when his sister Pauline met him in this disguise, she refused to kiss him until he had put on his own clothes. Neither of them ever forgot his... I mean, right there, doesn't it tell you that he changed to please his sister? So he must have had some familial love for her. Never of them ever forgot his humiliation, and it was thought that it was Pauline as much as his own bitter memories who nagged him to abandon his life of a country squire and make a last attempt to restore the power and wealth of the Bonapartes. Some writers have taken his fear of mobs to be a sign of underlying cowardice, but I fancy that few men in his place would not have quailed before King Mob. In his case, the motive of self-preservation was particularly compelling. With his belief in his great destiny, he could not tolerate the thought of his star setting in squalor. He had to survive to complete the story, to stake his claim for a place in history, to create his legend. Could his craven fear and poor showing in adversity have owed anything to a mood of depression following his well-publicized attempt at suicide? Was he in fact a suicidal type? I think not. The story is well known of how, after some hours of melancholy brooding, staring into space, he took poison. The attempt was thought to have failed because the poison given to him some years before by Dr. Cabanis had lost its potency and only made him ill. Those who cannot believe that he attempted suicide may be right. The attack of vomiting which ended the incident could have been one of the psychosomatic upsets to which he was notoriously subject when things were not going well. It is a known fact that from about 1812 he was always prepared for suicide, being provided with poison by Doctors Ivan, Cabanis, and Corvisart. It was the duty of his premier valet de chambre to see that the poison in a small leather sachet was always about his person. But many people who could not be called suicidal types have taken similar precautions against capture in wartime, and Napoleon, like the Nazi leaders, knew what to expect from some of his enemies. He may have joked with Caulaincourt as he left Russia in a sleigh in 1812 about the possibility of capture and exhibition in a cage, but he was not a man to contemplate humiliation. I do not think that he was a suicidal type, even if he did tell Montholon that he had seriously contemplated suicide in Paris shortly after the siege of Toulon. He was stopped, he said, from throwing himself into the river by a chance meeting with Alexander de Mazis, a former school friend and brother officer in his artillery regiment, but the penniless young captain in the political jungle of Paris in 1793 was a very different man to the fallen emperor in 1814, who had already shown his ability to survive disaster and was to do so yet once more. He did not need to stage a half-hearted attempt at suicide to attract sympathy, and if in a moment of depression he did make a serious attempt, it seems that he soon regretted it and did not care to speak of it. It revealed a crack in his armor of self-sufficiency. Napoleon was generous with money to his wife's relatives and protégés, especially to those whose support he wanted. He could afford to be generous. Henri Guillaumin has mercilessly exposed how he pillaged Europe and France herself for the benefit of the Bonapartes, but he was much less generous in more important things. It is all too easy to detect in his character traits of meanness, selfishness, jealousy, and above all egotism, from which these other blemishes grew. There must be only one great man in France. From the first he showed an amazing flair for publicity, and saw to it that all successes were attributed to him, and to him alone. He disliked and was jealous of successful generals, especially those whose reputations challenged his own. He never admitted that he was wrong, and had to throw the blame on others when things went wrong. His faithful chief of staff, Berthier, whom he ungenerously called a goose, whom he had made an eagle, was often the worst whipping boy, and once even had to take the blame when Napoleon peppered another gun at a shooting party. It was Messina, who lost an eye as a result of Napoleon's bad shooting. To Napoleon, the opportunist soldier of fortune, abstractions like duty, right and wrong meant little or nothing. His watchword was expediency. What do I care for a base action if it leads to success? He demanded. He was a great realist with a deep insight into psychology, except his own, apparently. But his own egotism was so powerful that he could not imagine any other motive governing a man's life. For example, he simply could not understand the idealism of the young German Staps, who tried to shoot him. He wanted to spare Staps and could not believe that he was unable to give up his ideas even to save his life. Goethe said that Napoleon, who lived wholly for ideas, was nevertheless unable to grasp the nature of idea motives. With his great flair for leadership, he could almost compel people to believe themselves capable of great achievements, but it is a fair, though severe, judgment on Napoleon that he was best at understanding men's weaknesses and exploiting these in his own interests. He lacked a sense of humor. Talleyrand called him the unamusable. Laure, maybe they just weren't funny. Laure Junot, later Duchess of Orleans, who had known him since she was a child and he a young officer, said that he was seldom roused to mirth, and his laughter had the disconcerting sound of ventriloquist's dummy. Even at second hand, his laughter has a hard and cruel ring, and was far too often at the expense of people who could not answer back. It often took the form of rudeness to women, including his wives, from which it is fair to make some deductions about his sexual leanings. Therefore, in examining these, his disconcerting laughter and schadenfreude, or pleasure in another's misfortunes, will be referred to again. It is in all his endless talk, his pronouncements intended to impress and improve mankind. Humor or wit found no place. One witty remark is often quoted. When his sisters were dissatisfied with their share of titles and precedence during discussions about his forthcoming coronation, he closed the argument by saying, "To hear you talk, one would think that I had robbed you of the heritage of the late kings. The late king, our father." Most dictators tend to be the subjects of surreptitious jokes, and one about Napoleon represented him as replying to an inquiry if he intended to go on and on until he took the seat of the Almighty, with the remark that this would not attract him as it was a dead-end job. Perhaps Napoleon could not afford a sense of humor, which was described by Mr. Eric Linklater in a televised interview as an enormous handicap if you are avid for power. Napoleon seems to have been fond of children, and many of them were very fond of him. But apart from some examples of actual cruelty, which will be mentioned in discussing his sadism, there was something a little strange, even cruel in his attitude to children. It amused him to accuse falsely a little niece of wetting her bed, to hide Betsy Balcomb's first party dress, letting this little friend of his early days in St. Helena cry herself to sleep. Wow, that's an actual indictment. He was a little kid and he falsely accused his little niece. Or was that? Or Bets? I don't know. I'm fucking losing track here. It also amused him, amongst other silly tricks, to smear jam or gravy over the face of his baby son, to push him over and scatter his toy. What the fuck? A devoted father he certainly was, and we see him in his most completely happy and human moods with this child, for whom he had waited so long and from whom he was soon to be parted forever. But he once contrived to sully even this cherished relationship. During his campaign for France in 1814, the Emperor sent him a portrait of the child saying his prayers. Napoleon, whose sense of public relations and their more nauseating as well as the reasonably tolerable aspects was ahead of his time, immediately sent the portrait back and ordered his wife to have it engraved with the caption, "I am praying to God to save my father in France," and to have it on sale in Paris within 48 hours. Marie Louise was not his wife for nothing, and she suggested that it would please the public if the little king was depicted in the uniform of the National Guard. All right, I'm stopping here just because I have to do stuff before work. So here, you can read the page for yourself. I'll even give you page 33. Because you're probably a Freemason, New World Order, lizard type, so there you go. There you go. Don't say I never gave you anything. Don't say it. Look at this. You can read it yourself. All right, that's all.